Hi everybody, in this video we get to talk to Ronesha Dennis, someone who has done something that a lot of us strive to do one day, and that is combining our interest and passion across a multitude of areas into one set of unified activities. And in the case of Ronesha, she combined her love of teaching, her love of programming, and turned it into a lot of fun activities where she has been able to teach students of all ages and also has written probably one of the best books on Python development that I ever had the chance to read. So we're going to learn all about how Ronesha got started, what motivates her to keep teaching, and what are the most difficult topics that students struggle with when trying to learn programming, and a whole lot more topics that come up along the way. It's going to be a fun one. Let's get started. Ronesha, great to chat with you. And so I've been following your work for quite some time, and we chatted about what you've been doing like a short while ago. And I figured it'd be fantastic to have you share more about yourself and the work you're doing with, with everyone who's listening and watching as well. So before I get started, I like to ask the first question is, how do you get started in tech? Of all the things that people could be doing in the world, what made you choose technology?
Oh, that's such a great question. So, honestly, I started coding when I was about, I want to say like 9 or 10. And what happened was, I think at that time, everybody had dial up and we had a computer. And so I was like, okay, I want to see if I can test some things out. My parents gave me freedom to use that computer and block up our phone line. So I really got a chance to just test out using mostly HTML. Like I definitely was not, trying back end stuff at 9 or 10. In fact, I don't even think I knew what it was at that point. But I tried a lot of HTML. And then when I was around 11 or 12, one of my favorite, artists at the time, one of my favorite musicians at the time, had a contest for someone to build a fan site for him. And so I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to win that contest and I'm going to build the greatest fan site in the world. And so I blocked our internet for a very long time. I blocked our phone line for a very long time, building out that, fan site. And I ended up winning the contest, which was really cool. And then in high school, I studied a lot of, networking. And I discovered I don't enjoy networking. So when I went to college thinking that networking was what computer science was going to be, I said, well, I don't want to major in computer science. I'm going to major in something else. So I ended up majoring in communications with a minor in computer science. And after graduating, I spent some time working in public health, which was really, really great. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of the issues just that we have going on in the world and how companies and nonprofits are working to approach those issues. But around 5 years in, I said, I love helping people and I do, I come from a family of educators. So I think that, helping people has just always been something that I've been taught. It's really, really important. But I didn't feel like that was the manner for me to do it. It just didn't fit. And I honestly, I wasn't happy. And I think that it happens that, sometimes you're just not happy with what you're doing. And so I sat with myself for a while and I said, what really makes me happy? What am I passionate about? And people ask themselves that question all the time. But for me to find the answer, it was really thinking about what I did as a child. What things would I have done for free? And I realized I did a lot of coding for free as a child. It wasn't that good. It wasn't that good. but it was something that I did for free that I really enjoyed. And so I said, you know what? I think that's the path that I want to take. So it turned into doing, one coding boot camp and then another coding fellowship and then getting a job, working in the field, deciding to go back and get a master's degree and teaching a little bit. And now I'm at a place where I'm like, okay, now I feel okay. So yeah, that's how I got here.
That's really fascinating because, recently I've been reading all these like quotes just keep coming up my LinkedIn and Twitter where I think it was Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. I think they were asked what helps someone be really successful. And they both, I think, said something very similar, which is the things you like to do as a teenager, at a certain age when you're younger, that's likely the thing that if you enjoyed doing it and you had a level of like competence in it, that's probably what you're destined to be successful doing as an adult as well. And I think what you just described right here is sort of an example where, as you were younger, you enjoyed coding, enjoyed dabbling in technology, and then you found your happy place getting back into that after a few years.
Yeah, yeah. But I think like having that period where I did something else again that I did enjoy, that there were portions of it that I did truly enjoy, but I didn't have the passion behind it. And fortunately, I was raised by people who really got to take on their passions as their jobs. And it's a different approach. It's completely different in how you approach doing your work when you actually really care about it. So now, I'm willing to work a little bit longer to, make sure that I'm producing something, whether it's for clients or for students, like making sure that I'm producing something that actually works and that will actually be something that can be meaningful and beneficial for them. And, you've read a couple of chapters of the book, and, even there, it was really important to me to share some of my experiences or some of, how I saw these things and how they clicked for me. Because I feel like that's something that helps to make tech more accessible. I think that people look at technology and they think like, this is so hard. And, only people who are like super smart can get into tech. And yes, there are, super smart people in tech, but also like the concepts at their foundational level, they're easy to understand if you can think about like how they apply in real life. And so like, that's how I think about things. And, hopefully that's what's going to be reflected in this book too.
No, that's actually really great because oftentimes like hard work and passion is often considered like an unstoppable, like force for being able to be both happy and successful, if not personally fulfilled in what you're doing. So you mentioned the book. We'll talk more about the book in a little bit. But before we get to that point, how did so you enjoyed working in tech. What was the switch that made you also want to help teach technology to other people? Because that's you touched upon a little bit, that's a very fun, but also, as I've also been a big fan of like teaching other people technology, a very challenging area.
It is challenging. But I think that what I learned about myself is that I learn from teaching others, from helping others. And that's really where you get to test, do I truly understand what I'm talking about? Like, do I truly get this concept? Because if you can't teach it, if you can't talk to others about it, then do you truly understand it yourself? Like that's always what I have been. And I guess, having a mother as a teacher, that's something that's how, things were taught to me. Like, if I can teach this to you, then that means that I understand it. And, also, I just really wanted to, I've talked to so many people who have said, this field is really hard to get into. I don't know if I can do it, and all things such as that. And I just don't believe that that's true. I do believe that the language that we use around technology is what makes people feel like it's inaccessible. So I wanted to get into teaching because I felt like I could relate to people. Like not only like because I feel like it's important to build relationships with people, but also because I felt like I could talk about it in a way that like it would click. And, I really wanted to, I started off working out with, I call them babies, but they weren't babies. They were between the ages of 6 and 10. But to me, that's really young. So, I started working with kids, and teaching them how to code. And with them, it was really fun because you have to figure out like, how does this relate to this little experience that this person has in life? Like, how can I talk about this in a way that they can get it? And that was really fun. And then from there, I taught with Black Girls Code for a while, which was a lot of fun. And then this summer, I actually spent the summer in San Francisco teaching with a program with CodePath, which was super cool because that was my first time working with college age students and teaching them like full stack development. And even then, like I found that the principle, like the approach that I was taking with the kids was the same as what I needed to take with these young adults who are in college. Like, find ways to help connect it to things that they understand. And I always test on my mother. One of the most fun things, I always test out topics on her. So, one time we were talking about React, and we were talking about like the states in React. And my mom, who's done no coding ever in her life, I said, Mom, I'm going to talk about state by talking about the different stages that a banana goes through. And so I explained that to her, and she's like, oh, I get this. Now I know what state is. She can't code. she can't code at all. But she was able to understand, the concept. And so, yeah, that's the approach that I take, and I really enjoy it.
Wow, that's a great example of how to explain state. I might have to borrow that and credit you at some point when I talk about state in React. So teaching 6 to 10-year-old kids, and then also ultimately teaching students who are more in the college age group, that must be very, very different in terms of, like, at least my assumption, of attention spans and prior knowledge they can use to relate to what you're trying to explain. How does that work? What language were you using to teach? Like, what programming language were you using to teach
Mm-hmm.
6 to 10-year-olds?
So for the 6 to 10-year-olds, we started off using Scratch, so MIT's Scratch programming app, and then later on we switched to Python.
How did that go? How were their first days grasping Scratch? How did that go? And how did the transition from Scratch to Python go?
Um, Honestly, I think it went really well. um, because, and this is also one of the things that when we talk about the book, I'll tell you a little bit about it. But, I tried to find things that they were familiar with. So, for example, like when I talk about things like conditional statements, I often talk about like the gaming controllers, because I loved gaming when I was, 5, 6, 7. I was always with my cousins, always playing like, Nintendo or Super Mario, whatever. Like, I was always playing a game. And so I figured, okay, so at that age, they should know a little bit about like gaming and whatnot. So I can bring that into this conversation about like, how do you use control structures? How do you use conditional statements? Of course, I don't know any of the newer controllers. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to show y'all this N64 from the 1990s, and I'm going to explain to you how the control structures here should work. And this is how we're going to talk about conditional statements. And I found that like that thing that worked with 6-year-olds, it also was able to work with 18, 19-year-olds. So I think it's finding those things that like are so common, and I call it common at an elementary level, and using that as a thread to teach the babies and also teaching the adults.
That's almost also very similar, like Richard Feynman's techniques for how you teach people is simplify things down to things you can easily relate to. Then the details
Mm-hmm.
of like what exactly it is being done, whether it's Python or Scratch or so on, that becomes much easier when you understand the usefulness of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So once children like learn from 6 to 10, what was your next steps after that? Like, were they going to be doing more of this kind of programming, or because I always felt that when I look into like what's available, my daughter's 5 years old, so she'll be 6 soon, and she might one day, hopefully, have the opportunity to take one of your classes, Ronesha. And so I always wonder, like, there's a gap between like when they learn early programming, and then there's a gap between then and when they either get into later in high school or they get into college. How do you bridge that
Mm-hmm.
gap, or is that something that you've looked into?
So that's a great question. And unfortunately, in my experience, I haven't had the chance to be a person that has bridged that gap. Um, but I think it's something that we as a tech community could look more into. I know that there are programs, for, the 5, 6, 7, 8 to 10-year-olds. And then after that, we tend to have programs for our older teens. But we don't truly have anything in the middle. And beyond not really having anything in the middle, we tend to not have things that are accessible. So when I talk about accessible, I'm talking about, a lot of the coding boot camps that I look at for kids are pretty, heavily priced, which means that, there are parents who want to teach their kids how to code, who want to make sure that they continue to have access to it, and it's not affordable for them. So I think as a tech community, that's probably something that we could look more into. Like, how can we ensure that we are making technology accessible for everyone? Because tech is not going anywhere. Not only is it not going anywhere, it's constantly growing. And so those things that they learn at 5, 6, 7, like, obviously great foundational things to have, but just like once you're in the workforce, you have to be able to keep up. And, we have to do better, I think, at learning how to bridge that gap. But to answer your question, I don't know yet. I don't know how we can do that now, but it's definitely a community thing that we should talk about.
No, absolutely. Because when we think about boot camps, are there ways of scaling it to it doesn't have to be, physically either in person? Actually, it's a different question, actually. There are online communities that help teach individuals. What is your take on learning in a boot camp where you have more hands-on, smaller groups, probably in person even, versus some of the more online distributed versions of learning?
Honestly, I really think it has more to do with understanding your learning style. Because I think that there are people who would truly benefit from being in, that kind of aggressive boot camp where every day is just code, 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 and, tend to be somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks. And again, I've done a boot camp, so, I definitely know like what that experience is. Um, versus people who are better at that individual learning and, able to sit in front of a computer all day. We've seen a lot of it with COVID, being able to sit in front of a computer and learn from, either videos or reading or whatever. Like, it really has to do with getting down to figuring out how you learn. So I don't necessarily, I think it's great that we have, this wealth of resources, that we have not only coding boot camps, but also online, schools, free code camp, that, things are available on YouTube. I'm happy that we have all of that, but it really comes down to like the person knowing what works for them.
That's spot on. You've taught a lot of students, and I'm curious to know what are some traits that successful students exhibit?
Um, I think it's the same traits that successful engineers exhibit. So it's all about just having that tenacity, being super determined and saying like, I'm going to figure this out. I tell my students all the time, like, when you are looking to come into, technology, come into coding as, a field, or even if it's just something that you want to learn a little bit about, like, you have to be okay with being frustrated because it's going to happen. So, one of the first things I say is, if you make mistakes, it's fine. Like, fail really fast and be okay with failing fast. Be okay with running the program before you have everything in place, so that you can run into that syntax error. You can run into, the runtime error or the logical errors that are going to come up. Be okay with that, because the more you run into those issues, the better you're going to get at the overall process. So, I think the biggest thing is being open to, you know, running into issues, letting them happen, and not letting it become a mental thing for you, not letting it become, I'm not good at this because I didn't get it right the first time. Like, I at my last job, I was a lead engineer, and I've since started my own business. But, you know, at that company, growing into that role, it came from being willing to take those risks. It came from being willing to, start fast, mess up, own that I messed up, going back at it again and saying, like, I'm going to figure out what is happening, what is causing this issue. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is like being open to being a lifelong learner. If you are not open to being a lifelong learner, I don't really think that you can work out in the programming field, because you have to consistently learn not only new versions of a language that you're comfortable with, but also, newer, newer technologies, newer frameworks, all those other things. When I reached out to you, I said to you, hey, I read your book on React because I needed to learn React in, a weekend so that I could be prepared for a project. So I found a book and it was really helpful to at least get me started. And that spoke to two things. One, like knowing my learning style. I learned through reading. So I needed to get a book that I could sit down with. I was not going to be successful if I tried to do the online YouTube. That was not going to work for me. It wasn't going to work because I was going to get distracted. So I needed a book that I could sit with, that I could handwrite it and figure it out, go through the frustrations and get to the other side of it. Also, willingness to learn something new. I'm not going to be able to be successful as a lifelong programmer if I'm not willing to, learn the Reacts when they come out, learn whatever framework is next. I haven't touched on Go yet, but at some point I need to learn Go. As much as Python is the language that I truly love, it's not the first language that I learned, but it's the language that I truly love, that I really enjoy teaching and enjoy working with. I also know that, if I want to be in this field and continue to be someone that people want to work with, I have to be willing to learn those new things. And learning comes with accepting the frustration of that process.
I think what you're touching upon is that on one hand, students are coming in to learn programming, but what they're really learning is more fundamental skill that's going to carry with them throughout their life, regardless of what they're ultimately learning. Because if we decompose, things in programming often don't work. It's something very subtle, but you got to keep trying. You'll make it work. That applies to almost any endeavor that I think people will face, whether it is technical or non-technical. I think these skills are applicable universally, which is something that I think it's one of those things where, like, you come for the coding, but you leave with the life lessons. It's really the ultimate.
For sure. Yeah.
So, quick aside, you mentioned Python was not the first programming language you learned. What was the first programming language?
So if I think about programming languages the way that I truly think about them, there are some people who say HTML is a programming language. I don't know if I agree with that one. But when we talk about back-end languages, the first language I learned was C++. Yeah, nice. It was C++, then C, then Ruby, and then Python.
Wow, that is quite the jump there, because when you do back-end development and C++, what was the first program you built? Yeah, you mentioned you described the app for your school, but before that, like as a hobby, what was the first time you wrote like Hello World, you wrote create an application, you're like, wow, this is really cool. I can type arcane things on the screen and then something more human understandable comes up. What was that first application?
The first, I would say, back-end programming application for me was definitely in school. And that was with C++. And that was, if I remember correctly, it was a calculator. And that was the first time I felt like I really built something. I can't even tell you the first time I wrote a Hello World, because I felt like I can be a lot. And so I was like, this isn't enough for me. Like, okay, that's basic. What's next? So the first time I really felt that excitement around building something on the back end was when I built the calculator and all of the functions of the calculator. And then on top of it, built that front end so that we could actually see, like, oh my gosh, this is how you make a desktop application. Never in my life even thought about it. So that was really, really cool.
Were you using Visual Studio .NET, or was it like C++ 6.0? What was your IDE of choice at the time?
It was the Visual Studio. Was it Visual Basic? It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been.
I think it was Visual Basic.
Because C++ was the first real programming that I learned as well. And it was also in school, actually. And I think we were using Visual C++, I think 6.0 or something, where you just like, I mean, the UI looks the same even today. Like, there's only so much you can do in a C++ text editing environment, but that's really cool. And, you got to work on the back end and the front end to see all of that. It is always magical, because it's one of those things where, the way I always like to describe it to people is you see cars on the road all the time. You're like, wow, there's a car, it's doing all these things. And then you realize that within like a few hours, you can actually build your own car as well with just some parts. And you're like, I had no idea that it doesn't take that much effort to build a very basic one. And then with enough practice and effort, you can build something more complicated. And that's how I always describe this programming in general, because we use apps all the time. Before you learn programming, it's all a little magical. It's like, how is this working? What's going on here? How does even the menus, like where you click the little file thing, a little drop down comes up. How does any of this even get to where it gets to? And then you start writing your first lines of code. You're like, wait, this is actually not that complicated. It's a little bit of hard work, of course, a lot of concepts you need to understand. But once you put those pieces together, it all just falls into place nicely.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure.
All right, now let's talk about Python and then you deciding to write a book. You
Yes.
mentioned earlier that I reviewed two of your chapters, loved every moment of it. It was really fascinating. And so what was your leap from teaching in person and teaching all the students to then going to writing a book?
Huh. So I'd mentioned earlier that I studied communications in undergrad, but also I've been writing since it's very interesting because it really does go back to childhood. The interest not only in coding, even though, like I said, it was more so HTML and making really pretty web pages, but also there was a lot of interest in writing as a child. So I started writing short stories, writing poetry, and I always loved it. Um, but I didn't, again, when I took a step away from coding, I also took that step away from like writing creatively too. And I think part of it is just the coming back to self. So the the process of like figuring out like what is it that I'm really passionate about. And when I realized, okay, I was really passionate about coding, I also had that passion and had that interest in writing. And I realized that as much as I really like the creative aspect of writing, I also enjoyed teaching, obviously, and I wanted to bring all of that together. So being able to teach, being able to talk about something that I really enjoy, that I feel like I know well, and then also, getting out that kind of creative energy of telling stories too. So, as you read a little bit in the book, um, I tell the stories of like how these things made sense for me. And also I give a lot of examples of like how you could actually see this in the real world. And that's a little bit of my creativity coming out in the book. And so that's kind of how I got there. It was like putting all of the passions together, all of the things that I've really enjoyed and saying like, hey, I want to package this and I'm okay with putting my name on it. So that's how we got there.
No, that's really, really great to hear that you combine both your interest in writing with technology. And so that's like almost like a force multiplier in like you want to do something. It's like you have two passions that you're able to combine and then put into something that is going to be really exciting when people, read it and all of that. When you started writing, what was your process like? Because writing a book is a lot of discipline, a lot of time, and a lot of frustrating moments where in the middle you're just going like, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? So walk me through how it all went for you.
Oh wow. So it was quite a process. Honestly, part of it was that because I was also teaching at the time, um, I got to see like what is it that my students are experiencing? What order do I need to present this information to them so that they get it? And a lot of that went into creating the initial outline for the book. So, what's the order of how I need to present this content? What are the examples that are like really hitting home? And then also, I like to have a lot of like motivational discussions in my classrooms too. So, also, like, what motivational things can we also include in this book? And then after that, it was really just sitting down. And let me tell you, that was a very hard part. That was so, so difficult for me. Just sitting down and, letting it all just come out, writing and making sure that it made sense, that it was simple. One of my primary readers, because, the book is for beginners. It is for people who have never coded before. So I said, well, I got to work with people who've never coded before. So I got my mother to be one of my, primary readers, and having her sit with the book and say, like, hey, mom, do you feel like you can code from this? Do you feel like you can learn from this? And by the way, she's 72. So, at a point in her life where it's like, oh, it's a little scary learning something new. And, she felt like those concepts were connecting for her. So the process has really been like just sitting, outlining, trying to simplify things, rereading a lot, going back and editing a lot. Because there were things that I read and I said, okay, this makes sense to me, but it makes sense to me with the knowledge that I currently have. Is this going to make sense? I cannot say that this book is for beginners and then have things here that are so technical in the way that they're written that it's going to scare a person off, because then that's the opposite of what I want to do. Like, I truly feel like there is enough space in the technical world for all of us. I truly do. Because not everybody who learns how to code is a person who wants to be a developer. Not every person who learns how to code is a person who's, saying that, hey, I want to go in and I want to take people's jobs. And I think sometimes people are afraid of, making it more accessible because they don't want someone to come in and eventually take from them. But I feel like it's so important for people to be able to talk about tech, even the basic things, whether or not you want to be, a product owner, or you just want to build your own thing, but you don't want to be the person building it. You just want to own it, but you want to be able to talk about like the process that goes into it, So for me, it was super important to make sure that like people who have not had that technical upbringing that I was fortunate to have, that they'll be able to read it and say, we get this. Even if it's at the most basic level, we get it.
No, that's a very great way of framing why learning about programming in some ways is very beneficial. Even if, like you mentioned, people never end up writing code professionally or doing some of these things, just having that fundamental understanding of how things work is carries forward in so many ways, which is often the argument you often hear about why do people need to learn about biology or physics and things like that. It's like, I'm never going to build a pendulum and like measure how fast it's going to go. Why am I learning about this? I think in some ways it's kind of like, I guess, exercising in, do you really need to? It's like, yeah, in long term, it accrues benefits over a period of time. And just like that, your brain also needs to be expanded and pushed into various corners. I was actually reading this, or I love reading articles on like what motivates people to learn, because I greatly enjoy teaching, and so for me, it's always why do people learn? What's the benefit of teaching people hard things? And one of the things that was actually really fascinating is that there's something about just like learning, when you learn something really difficult and really hard and you get through to the other side, there's something psychologically that gives you this confidence of going like, there is value in the grind. There's value in learning something hard and then getting through it, because that then helps build your confidence to go like, wait, if I can learn this thing and be able to be successful at it, what other things can I just, if I just put my effort into it, put some time into it, can I also be equally successful? And that kind of gave me a different perspective on like why teaching hard things sometimes makes sense. I mentioned this, I think, when we chatted last time, is that out of the blue, I decided to write a book on data structures and algorithms. Not because I am passionate about the topic, but it's completely unrelated to anything I've ever thought about. I enjoy teaching people programming, especially things that move and display on screen. So this is something completely unrelated. But my motivation after reading that quote and reading that the study on that was really behind like, there's no way any developer ever, outside of like really bad interviews in various companies, where they have to learn anything about algorithms on a day-to-day basis. It's often a case where you just need to know the concept at a high level so you can go to Google, type in what you need to know, copy and paste the code, and you're good to go. But learning about the details of why something works the way it does, I feel like might unlock new pathways in your brain that help you simplify things that you might have thought were very complicated. So I'm going to find out eventually if that was a good idea or not. But I think it's just really fun to teach people hard things and seeing them succeed and learn at it. And then once you do that, it's all relative. What used to be hard before now becomes easy. And if you have the mindset, to touch upon what you talked about earlier, where you constantly keep learning, constantly trying new things, pushing yourself outside the comfort zone, it just makes you more effective because, at the end of the day, there's always a finite level of opportunities in technology for people. And so the more you can set yourself apart by being very good at what you do, and because you genuinely want to learn more and do these things, I always feel like it gives you an advantage, regardless of what you're doing, whether you want to work professionally or unprofessionally.
Yeah. Yeah, for
As
sure.
part of your boot camps and some of the trainings, a large number of your students will ultimately are learning so they can get either do more programming in the future or actually end up using it as a way to get a job in technology. One thing I've always found that it always, is it's a little bit one of the things where like it kind of frustrates me sometimes, but I also realize the reality of it is you want to get people to learn programming first of all because it's a hard concept. You want to first learn it. Oftentimes, though, what people learn and what they enjoy learning may not be what the job market is actively looking for. How do you bridge that gap? And how do you help people understand that what they learned here is not irrelevant? It's just that you can use it as a stepping stone to learn what you ultimately need to learn as well. Because learning to learn is the real skill of programming, not necessarily that you learn the syntax of Python or Go or C++ or C.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Uh, you have to teach people the value of learning to learn. I have very close friends who are in, different fields. And, one of the things that they always say to me is like, I have to learn how to learn. And I think any pathway that you use to learn how to learn is beneficial for you. So, being in the programming world for me now, um, I feel, I hate to use the word unstoppable, but that's the word that I'm going to use because I feel like, I'm so confident now in my ability to learn new things. And so one of the things that I try to instill when working with students at any point is, you may decide you don't like coding. You may decide this is not, the right field for you, that you want to do, medicine, you may want to do law, whatever you want to do. But if you can accept the challenge while you're here, the challenge of learning, the challenge of building, I guarantee you that at the end of it, if nothing else, if you've learned that, hey, I hate coding, you will also learn, but I'm capable of building. I'm capable of doing whatever it is that I want to do. And if that's all that I'm able to achieve when working with a student or when someone reads my book, then I've done my job.
It's a very fine line, as I'm finding out, in terms of like, how do you encourage kids to go through and learn something that they may not be interested in without making it to the point where they're like completely frustrated and you turn them off from the field forever? How do you balance those almost like opposite ends of the spectrum?
That's such a difficult question. That is such a difficult question. I think, having conversations. I think one of the things that we have to do as adults, as teachers, as anybody who, works with kids or has kids is teaching them the value of understanding that not everything is for you and that's okay. But you have to be here in this moment and accept where you are now. So, hey, it may be frustrating that you have to learn a little bit about programming, just like it may have been frustrating when you were 3 years old and your mom had to read this book to you and you didn't really like that book. But you know what? Sometimes that's just what you have to deal with. And you go through the process, and at some point, you're going to get to the other side of that very frustrating process. And you're going to realize, like, there was beauty in it. It may take a long time. I look at, there are things that happened 7, 8, 9 years ago in my life that were really, really frustrating moments. They were really frustrating. And I look back, I look at where I am today and I'm like, oh my God, had I not gone through that frustrating moment 8 or 9 years ago, then I don't think I would be prepared to write a book, or I would be prepared to build programs for people, or, I would be prepared for anything else that's going on in my life. So to answer the question, I think it's important to have real conversations, even with, a 4, a 5, a 3-year old and say like, hey, I need you to be patient now because 5 years from now, 10 years from now, maybe even 20 years from now, this is going to make sense for you.
Yep. And the best part of what you just mentioned here is that there's no age to when you need to be reminded of that, whether you're young or whether you're fully an adult. It's never too early to keep being reminded that you'll be doing things that you may not want to do, but you might not realize the value of what you're doing. And then as you see it through it, you're not going to fully realize the benefits of it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Because again, there are things that I was, working on as a child that now, you know, 13, 14 years into my career, I'm like, wow, those things that I learned at 10, 11, it's crazy that they now apply. And I never thought that, this thing was going to come up as something that I could relate to or I could use as an example, or that, made something else make sense for me. But, I think everything has meaning, everything has purpose. And that's what we have to remind, again, children and adults when we're working with them, that sometimes you run into those frustrations, but they're there for a reason.
Yeah. So I love jumping between topics. It's almost like, in many ways, you're like watching a movie and then you're like, jumping between various timelines in a multiverse kind of a world. So getting back to your book again, you mentioned that you were writing, and there are different kinds of writers. Some are notorious for following a very strict schedule, a very strict routine, where if anything is off, their brain is like, nope, I can't write right now. What was your routine like? Did you have a fixed time where you blocked off time in your calendar and said, I'm going to be writing between this period of time every day. I'm going to be using this particular tool to make my writing, consistent. What was the exact details of that like?
No. So my writing process is very much so, I like to make sure that I'm in the right energy to do things. So, if I'm feeling productive today, then and this was very difficult because, it would always happen on that random Saturday when I had plans with my friends. And I would be looking forward to those plans all week. And then that Saturday morning would come and I would wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm in the energy to write right now. And so because this is the energy that I'm in, this is where I'm going to stay. And I disappointed a lot of people that way. But, I think it worked out really well for me, just, recognizing like, when is the right time? When do I feel the most productive? And this is the same thing with work. Fortunately, I was very, very fortunate to work with companies that allowed me to have some flexibility in terms of when I worked. So, if I didn't want to do a 9 to 5, I could do maybe like a 3 to sometime in the PM, which meant that, I was working when I was at like an optimal productivity for myself. And that was the same approach that I took with the book. So there were days when I would sit down and I really, really wanted to write and I just couldn't. And so instead of saying to myself, like I may say with programming sometimes, instead of saying to myself, like, I'm going to force myself to do this, I said, I really want this to be, a natural and authentic experience in writing. So I'm going to step back and I'm going to wait until I'm actually in that productive energy. Now, that said, because that was the, path that I took, I also said, well, you still have to set deadlines now. Because if you're saying I'm only going to work on this when I'm, in that productive energy, you also have to say to yourself, well, on, August 5th, I'm going to be done. And on August 5th, we are going to switch into, full edit mode. And if that means that sometimes you have to tap into that productive energy when you're not ready, then you need to figure it out because you have to still meet your deadline, even though it's a self-imposed deadline because it's, self-published. Like I still had to have that conversation with myself. So it was really about just finding a balance, but also making sure that I was presenting this information in a way that really, that I could be proud of. Because I was not going to put my name on something that, at the end of the day, I'm not proud of the way that it's presented.
Yep. That is a the discipline needed to write a book. I think only other people who've written books in the past will fully appreciate it, because when you look at the end of the day, it's like, wait, 300, 400 pages of content. When you look at it just at the going, like, there's no way I'm writing 340 pages of content. But then you do the routine. It's like every day you write a handful, or whenever you have the energy and the right mental space to write, you write 5 pages, 10 pages, and so on. And over a period of time, that accumulates to basically a large book, which gets me to my next question. Do you create a table of contents first and you follow that from the very beginning, or do you kind of just write on whatever topic you are inspired to write about at that moment, and then at the end of the day then collate them into an order that matches what you've been seeing from your students?
So what's so interesting is I started with an outline and I knew I was going to follow that outline, and I did not follow that outline. so, so I started off and I said, obviously I'm going over the basic concepts here, the basic topics. So, I mean, I know what those are and I know the way that they should be covered, but I would have days where, I hadn't experienced that day, and I'm like, okay, like, I feel like this is something that could fit into that section. So I'm just going to jump to writing this, which is not the order that I would have ever wanted to write it. I wanted to take a very sequential approach, and that's not what happened. But I think that's okay. I think that, I say to people all the time that coding is also very creative. Like, people don't often think of software developers as creatives, but we are. We are. So in the same way that, people have to tap into their creative energy to, build art, or, to build music, or any of those other things, software developers, software engineers, programmers, whatever term, people want to use, like, they have to also tap into that energy. And I think there were times when I kind of tapped into a section that I wasn't ready to write yet. But I said, you know what? I'm just going to go with it. It was fun.
Do you have a process for taking notes? I'll give you an example. I have my notes app on my iPhone all the time, and there'd be the most random. I'll be sitting in traffic, at a stoplight, for example. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Quickly bring up my phone, write the note down for like later. And I've talked to many writers who all also have a very similar kind of approach. Depending on what they're doing, they might be like, inspiration strikes, or like, I don't have time to then write it right now, but I'm gonna take notes on it for remembering it later. Do you ever have those moments, and do you also have a process for just making sure those ideas never get lost forever?
So I had to develop a process because I like to think that I have the greatest memory in the world. I do not. I do not. So initially, when I had what I thought were good ideas, I'm like, I'm going to remember this. And then I would get home and I would sit for 20 minutes and I'm like, oh my God, I don't remember that at all. So eventually what I decided to do was have a cloud copy of the book that I could pull up anywhere. And I would just jump to that section and then add a comment that, hey, I want to add this note here, related to this thing. And then I would write maybe like a sentence. And sometimes that sentence was not enough because I wouldn't actually remember like what I wanted to get out of it. But a lot of times it did help. I would say I took it's very interesting. I'm usually very, very structured, and I'm usually very organized. And I think that it's so important to be that way, especially when you're coding. And in this process, I stripped that completely, and I'm okay with it. I think that as much as structure is important, as much as, it can really bring you to a great product, I think that when you strip that away and you say, I'm just going to go about this the way that it really flows in my mind and the way that it's coming to me authentically, I'm okay with that. So it was interesting because the people who knew that I was, there were friends who knew that I was, working on a book. And we would have conversations and they're like, Ronesha, we're so accustomed to you having deadlines and all these other things. And I took that away But I think it was, for me, it was very beneficial. You know, it may sound absolutely crazy to someone else, but for me, as a person who is so structured in every other aspect of my life, I said, this is the place where I'm going to apply structure, but I'm going to let it flow freely first.
Yep. And there's a few things I've been reading from, like, I love reading other content creators explain their process and things like that. And a lot of like scientific studies also on just writing. How does writing really work? And one of the best explanations I heard is that our brain, when we're writing, it almost like three distinct phases that your brain, not only more phases, but the three ones that, relevant for what we're talking about here is that there's the ideation phase, there's the creation phase, and there's the editing phase. And the more you
Mm-hmm.
can isolate your brain to be focused in one of those areas, the more successful you'll be. Because if you're jumping between ideation, creation, and editing and all these things, there's a large amount of energy just being wasted. The context switching in general, even our brain has its
Yeah.
own smaller ways of context switching, which is goes back to your point about like when you have an idea in your brain of like, I'm not going to forget this. I'm not going to forget this. Brain, remember this. 10 minutes later, you already forgot it because your
Mm-hmm.
brain went from like the ideation phase to some other part of it where now it's not just a case of remembering. It's like I travel mentally to whatever space I was in earlier to remember that, which is why even if you take notes and you aren't detailed enough in the context, it still gets lost. And I always found it very interesting because some writers say like, when it comes to writing, I don't do any editing. I just write all the words that I can that seem relevant at that point. Even if it doesn't make any sense, I don't stop. I just basically just put all the words down. And then when I'm in the editing phase of my brain, I then go back and rewrite it for clarity and conciseness and all those various things, but never mixing them both together, because if I do that, the end result is I wrote less, and what I wrote isn't actually as good as it would have been otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, next time, like you mentioned that you use your students and your mother as for feedback in terms of like what resonates and what doesn't resonate and things like that. When you're teaching programming to students, what was the most difficult concept for them where it just took them a lot of effort to wrap their heads around?
That's a great question. And I think what it often comes down to for most languages is not the, foundational stuff that not the conceptual stuff, it's syntactical stuff. I feel like that's what tends to be most difficult for really all students. Like understanding like things like in Python, using indents, using indentation, things like in, JavaScript, using, your curly braces. I feel like that's where students tend to really struggle because it seems to be, it's not natural. Like it's not a natural way of writing. We learn how to, write in blocks and put a tab at the beginning of a paragraph. And I don't even know if they do that anymore, but we learn, our MLA and our APA. And then when you come into learning a programming language, I tell people all the time, like you're learning another language. You're learning another language. You're learning everything that comes with that language. So what I have found has been the most difficult for students has been like learning how to truly sit and apply it, which again goes right back into syntax. When we're talking about concepts, they get the concepts, they can talk about the concepts, but then the actual application and, running into that frustration with syntax, that's where you definitely have some issues. But then when they overcome that and they realize like, oh, even professional programmers have this issue where like, especially like with context switching. So if you're a person who like, does Python on the back end and React on the front end, I know it happens for me all the time. It's like, I'm switching from one way that I have to do it in Python, another way that I have to do it in JavaScript. And I'm like, this isn't working. And it's like, well, duh, because you've used something that's not even, applicable in that language. Um, yeah, that's where I really saw like a lot of struggles. But I feel like I try my hardest to create environments where they feel comfortable and they feel comfortable asking like, what am I doing wrong here? And it's like, oh, you need a colon. And that's it.
Yeah, and that brings to the biggest question that everyone is talking about these days, artificial intelligence. Because one thing that AI is really good at is syntax and making it so that you don't have to worry about the details of how your code works. You just have to describe what you want in great detail. Do you
Hmm.
think it is a good idea for students to get familiar with AI very early on in their programming career? Or is it valuable for them to first really understand the language, the syntax, and all the details before they start delegating to an AI assistant?
Oh, wow. That's such a difficult question. And it's one that I've had a lot of conversations with other engineers about. Um, I think, in my personal perspective, I think that they should be learning the basics of the language and becoming familiar, becoming comfortable with that, and then stepping into using AI. I think AI is beautiful. I think that, it's going to be used to build and grow really great things. I do have some fears that it's growing a little quickly. Not gonna lie, I have some fears around that. Um, but I think that, like, getting those basics again, everything is about foundation. And when you can feel comfortable with the foundation of something, you can switch to anything. So if we start children off too early or students off too early with AI, I fear that starting them off too early means that they're going to skip over the foundational steps, which means when it's time to, if they decide, I want to be in the workforce, when it's time to do that, they're not going to be prepared to do it. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping, I'm hoping that, like, the focus remains in the foundation, and then as a level up from the foundation, like, now let's talk about artificial intelligence. Let's talk about, everything else that can be used to help you create something that, is a little bit more polished.
Yeah, it's a tough one because I struggle with this all the time. And when I'm trying to explain some concept to it, I'm like, do I even need to explain this anymore? Kind of, they can just go to any of these AI assistants and be able to work. And the example, actually, mentally, I argue with myself on this one is that I do not know machine code. I do not have any concept of writing at such a low level language. I enjoy higher level languages like Python and JavaScript and so on. And one could always make the argument that because I don't know machine code or assembly and that level of detail, instead I went to a higher level language, maybe prompt engineering, the way you actually describe to an AI what you want to build, is a programming language on its own. And that's going to be the world where we abstract away one level of detail, which is the actual language and the syntax itself, and you focus on that layer. Now, it's going to be a while because there's a lot of people who do work with hardware and do work with low level languages, but they need to know, in your case, like C, for example, which in my mind is a very low level language. It's very difficult and you can easily do things that can get the application in a state and the computer in a state where you're like, this is wrong in so many ways. And so I always struggle with this concept because it could be a moment in time thing where when Java, I always remember, like, I'm old enough, now to be like, when Java first became really popular, people were like, wait, you don't have to worry about memory management? What's going on here? Like, you have to know how pointers work. You know how all these things work. And in Java, you're like, nah, the virtual machine takes care of all these things. Now replace Java with like artificial intelligence and replace, memory management and pointers with syntax and debugging and your coding environment. I see the same kind of things playing, in its own way here. And even back then, Java wasn't always efficient. Any memory managing artificial initially was not as efficient as you manually being able to allocate and deallocate memory and things like that, which is kind of where we are right now, where sometimes, they call it hallucination, where the AI just makes up random stuff. And if you're not knowledgeable enough of like subtle details, you could ship production quality code that has major security and memory and all these flaws in it. And it's tough for me to rationalize, like, where am I? Have I reached that point in my technical, understanding where everything new is like, this is too old. It's like musical taste in a way. I'm like, nope, the best music is what I grew up listening to. Everything after this is just like, it's just blah. And so I do struggle with where AI fits in this.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I do too. Um, and it could just be my own, it could totally be just a personal preference that I have some fear of how quickly AI is growing. And I think that's where my stance is on it, that I have some fear of how quickly things are moving. I saw the other day that AI was being used to create music that sounds just like the artist, and you
Yeah.
know things like that are a little bit scary. But I was also a Smart House kid, so like not Smart House, yes, Smart House, the movie on Disney, where the house, eventually decided to take over everything and lock the family in, and that was a bit much for me. Um, and so I think I step away a little bit from anything that can put us in a place where um, we don't still have a little bit of control, just a little bit, um, as as developers. So I think that's as far as I can go there.
Yeah,
I'd like for us to have a little bit of control. And, I think it's different when we're talking about, okay, just using AI to help us, improve something that we've already developed. That's one thing. When we're talking about AI to be the creator of everything, I I feel a little bit of hesitancy around it for sure.
yeah, especially if you're learning programming, you're learning the fundamentals of it, there might be a lot of value in knowing how things work, even if after
Hmm.
a while you never have to actually use it. Just like, how Photoshop abstract away, like writing individual pixel math to get things on the screen and so on. But at least knowing the different vector graphics and raster and why some looks good when you zoom in and others don't. That little fundamental concepts are important to know, even if you never have to write an algorithm for making sure that things you draw look appropriate. Now it's a fun topic. I think we can probably spend hours going deep into that as well. But your book is coming out soon. What is your book called?
So it is going to be called Python the Relatable Way for the Future Coder Who's Never Written a Line of Code. So the title scares me a little bit because, I hope that when people read it, they really feel like, I am a future coder and I've never written a line of code and I can do it by the time I'm done with this book. And that's the goal, to, get people to be, you know, to feel like this is a field that they can tap into, or after reading the book, decide maybe it's not. And I'm okay with that as well.
And what are your plans on marketing the book?
Plans on marketing. Wow. So I have really been thinking about that. Honestly, I initially, when I started the book, I was thinking about a younger audience. But then as I've written more, I've realized that I do want this audience to be more young adults who want to be able to, break into coding. So maybe like a pre-boot camp book. So if you're thinking about doing a coding boot camp, but you're not sure if you're going to enjoy coding, because I feel like this often happens to people. They look at tech and they say, hey, tech is the way to go if I want to be able to, grow my income and create more security and things of that nature, but they don't actually know if they're going to like it. And then they spend, thousands of dollars to go to a coding boot camp just to discover that this really isn't what they want to do. Um, and so this book, I think, is for those individuals who want to decide, is this even a path that I want to take? So I will be, trying to do marketing and outreach to, individuals who are interested in things like that. Individuals who just want to learn a little bit about coding. Like, honestly, the community is open for potential readers. Like, this is not a book that is written for, the person who's already a techie. I can have the technical conversation, as necessary with technical folks, but this book is not about them. This book is not about the person who's been coding for 10, 15, 20 years. This book is about the person who wants to decide, is this for me, or who wants to know a little bit about it. And so the marketing plan right now is to just promote through blogs, promote through podcasts, and also promote through me. So promote through, building relationships with individuals who may be thinking about coding. I have conversations with people all the time about wanting to come into the tech field. And, I'm going to be honest with you about the things that are really fun, but also the things that are not fun at all. I've had some really great experiences being a software engineer, but I've also had some experiences that have not been fun at all, with people questioning, capabilities or, asking for a skill set that I don't fully have, but, wanting me to be a master in it, so there have definitely been, I've had that up and I've also had that down. And I've had a lot of conversations around it. So this book is for anybody who's like trying to figure out, is this what I want to get into? I'm a little bit nervous about it. I'm not even certain if I'm good enough because that happens too. It's for anyone who wants to read it. And so we're going to market it to a very large community.
That sounds amazing. Wish you the best of luck on it. Ronesha, it was
Thank you.
fantastic chatting with you. And, we should definitely do this again in the future.
Yeah, we definitely should. And Karupa, I just want to say thank you so much to you, just for being open to not only having me on your podcast, but you have just been such an inspiration throughout the entirety of this process. I reached out to you because I said, hey, Karupa, I'm writing a book and I read your book and I read your story. And, I wanted to find out if you would be willing to tell me a little bit about what you did to get where you are. And you have just been so incredibly open and so incredibly helpful. And, that's not always something that you see in this field. And so I'm so grateful for you. So I just wanted to, tell you thank you publicly because you really do deserve that. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Ronesha. And, we'll catch up further.
Alrighty.